Today we're going to look at the rise and diffusion of Christianity during the Pax Romana, this time of Roman peace established by Augustus. And we are going to ask the question of how a tiny, obscure religion formed on the edge of the Roman Empire, in one of the most powerless places in the world, grew to be so powerful to take over not only the empire, but all of Europe as well, over time, of course. The story of Christianity begins in a recently conquered faraway province of the Roman Empire called Judea during the Pax Romana. And this story raises the issue of how empires are experienced from people on the receiving end of conquest. People doing the conquering leave lots of historical records about the glory and the, pomp, and they make coins like the ones you see on the screen that talk about like the victory of Augustus, Judea captured. But on the receiving end, things are a little different. Rome conquered many lands and many different people, making Rome a rich, diverse empire. From the tribes of ancient Britons to the west, territories in North Africa, including Egypt to the south, and all the way on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, Rome had even conquered Judea, which had been the promised land of the Jews in the Middle East. Christianity emerged in this part of the world, in Judea. How did an idea that emerged here conquer Rome to become a dominant world religion? We know a general pattern to look for from our study of history of how religions tend to spread, but let's look at the specifics from Christianity first. The Pax Romana was a time of relative peace, and that meant that a lot of trade, a lot of movement, and a lot of diversity in the Roman Empire. As Mary Beard writes in the book SPQR, this was a world in which people could, as never before on this scale, make their homes, their fortunes, or their graves thousands of miles away from where they were born. This is super rare in history. This was a world in which the population of Rome relied on basic food grown at the edges of empire, and in which trade distributed new tastes, smells, and luxuries, spices, ivory, amber, and silks, from one end of the Mediterranean to the other and beyond, and not only to the super rich. This level of movement is incredibly rare in history, and it made the Roman Empire during the Pax Romana unique and vibrant, especially if you were a Roman citizen. This story also hides a good bit of exploitation, though. Even in this map of trade in the Roman Empire, if you look close, one of the goods that this map is counting as trade is human beings, slaves. So what looks like trade can sometimes be the spoils of conquest. Not just slaves, but also money, tax money, that kind of thing. Material benefits. And indeed, like getting resources, getting goods, getting these spoils of conquest is the primary goal of empires. As Timothy Parsons writes in his book, The Rule of Empires, the essential characteristic of empire is the permanent rule and exploitation of a defeated people by a conquering power. By their very nature, empires can never be humane, liberal, or tolerant. Would-be Caesars throughout history sought glory, land, and most important, plunder. This true nature of empire was so much more obvious in pre-modern times than it is today, when it was unnecessary to disguise these base motives. In recent centuries, imperial conquerors have tried to hide their naked self-interest by promising to rule for the good of their subjects. This was and always will be a cynical and hypocritical view. Kennard. Empire has never been more than naked self-interest masquerading as virtue, he writes. And indeed, getting resources is the entire point of building an empire. But of course, people also like to tell a nicer story of conquest, especially when they're talking about themselves. And in Rome, the nicer story had a lot to do with an idea of civilization, civilizing. The Pax Romana was a pretty decent time to be alive if you were a Roman citizen. And Rome boasted of its ability to bring the benefits of civilization to the places that it conquered. This was its nice idea that kind of justified all the violence and looting that conquering actually involves. In order to conquer a place, in order to violently take people's stuff, and like own their homeland, most people like to be able that they're doing something good, not just being violent and taking other people's stuff, but doing it to achieve some sort of a greater good. You can think of this as like an ideological justification, a value-based excuse for conquest that is separate from the material or economic or self-serving reasons that you actually have to go take over a place. And for the Romans, it was bringing the benefits of their civilization to conquered people. If you haven't seen a movie called The Life of Brian by Monty Python, there's this great scene. It's set in Roman Judea, where the characters they want to rebel against Rome, but they're trying to tell themselves, like, why. And they're like listing all of the things that the Romans did for them, right? Rome brought languages to its empire, 2 languages, Latin and Greek, that united the empire in a new way. It brought an efficient system of roads, sanitation, aqueducts, public works, irrigation, education, wine, medicine, that kind of thing to the empire. And when Rome said they were bringing civilization to the empire, in addition to their laws, that's the sort of thing that they had in mind. Of course, from the receiving end of empire, none of this was something that they'd asked for, right? It wasn't peaceful for them to have been conquered. Being taken as a slave is not a peaceful or pleasant experience. And being ruled over by a foreign power that doesn't necessarily understand or appreciate your culture is something that doesn't tend to go over well with people. And that's the context where our story begins, in a part of the world that Rome had just taken over, and that did not want to have been taken over by Rome. Here's where we get to like the limits of history for studying the religion of Christianity. When we study religions in this class, right, we're looking at them as social scientists. So we look at religions through a secular view. How did they affect history? And when we look at the historical record for this time period in Roman Judea, there's actually not a whole lot to go on if we want to understand the central character of Christianity, the person who founded it, Jesus of Nazareth. We know 2 things from the historical record, and only 2. We know that he was a Jew who led a popular Jewish movement in Palestine, or Judea, at the beginning of the 1st century. And we know that Rome crucified him for doing so, and that they reserved crucifixion as a punishment for treason. So they saw him as a political prisoner, a rebel, a revolutionary even. Other than that, that's where the historical record stops. We can fill in a lot from context. We know that this was, as Reza Aslan writes in his wonderful book, Zealot, about this very question, this was an era marked by the slow burn of a revolt against Rome that would forever transform the faith and practice of Judaism. So we know that Jesus was part of a general trend of a conquered people resisting the conquerors. Records after that get pretty blurry, largely because after Jesus died, there was a Jewish rebellion in the year 66, and it was successful. They kicked the Romans out, but then the Romans came right back 4 years later, and they took revenge on Jerusalem. They destroyed it. They exiled the Jews from their promised land and forced them to live as outcasts among the pagans of the Roman Empire. And because of that change, it's highly likely that the story of Jesus himself probably changed with it, especially among the early Christians who were just trying to survive. As outcasts living in an empire that had destroyed their homeland, the story of Jesus as a revolutionary Jewish nationalist would have been very threatening to Rome, and not one that would have like worked very well for early Christians' preservation. And instead, we see the rise of an interpretation of Jesus as a more pacifistic spiritual leader without a whole lot of interest in earthly matters. This would not have been a threat to Rome, and it helps to explain why people began to convert to the religion in Rome, even though at first it was formed kind of against Roman imperial expansion. So, though we don't know a whole lot about the historical Jesus, we don't have a great historical record of him. His idea, their religion, Christianity, has its own history that we can trace in a lot more detail, especially as it spread and changed over time. So what we're doing now is actually something called intellectual history, which is the history of ideas. Ideas have their own histories that can be studied and traced. They have causes, they make big effects, they're influential. And intellectual historians spend a long time looking at these ideas and putting them into historical context. We've already looked at the history of a few big ideas like rationalism. And religions are some of the most intriguing, interesting ideas to study, not only in terms of like how they arise and in response to what, but why some religions survive and others just don't is kind of a fascinating historical riddle. And we also, in this study, can infer some patterns. We know that generally religions that tend to last are attractive to the poor. They give people hope for a better life. Sometimes they give people a sense of control in their lives when otherwise they might not have much. And specific to Christianity, Christianity appealed to the poor of Judea, people who were unhappy with what they saw as the corruption in the elite, wealthy Jewish church, and those rebelling against being ruled by the Roman Empire. And here it's such a common idea, especially in the West. Like the quote, "It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven," is one that a lot of people know. At the time, it would have been an access to paradise that would be made more difficult the more money and wealth and power you had. This was a very empowering idea for the poor. And so that was really appealing for a lot of people. Secondly, we know that religions that tend to take off do so when there are stable empires around to keep trade routes safe, which make it easy for people to move around, which makes it easy for them to spread ideas. And Christianity arose during kind of the perfect time for this, during the Pax Romana. This would have been the safest time to move around the empire. And missionaries like Paul would have used the trade routes and the Roman roads to initially spread this religion, to give it a fighting chance to survive. We've also learned that when religions become adopted as the official religion of an empire or a state, they spread with the borders of the empire. Rulers can use religious beliefs to kind of hold society together. If you want the big fancy word, this is called a unifying ideology. But if you can get everybody in your empire to believe the same thing, they're more unified than otherwise. It's easier to rule a population like that. Rulers can also use spreading religious belief as a justification for further conquest. Like, we're not conquering the new world, we're saving the natives from going to hell. Maybe by killing them and taking their stuff, but like we swear we're saving them. This like missionary-based conquest is something that you'll see a lot as we go through history. As it relates to early Christianity, this story really takes off. Christianity really takes off as a religion when the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity, making it the official religion of Rome. This religion took such hold that even after the Roman Empire fell, it remained the dominant religion in Europe, and then spread as different European states conquered different parts of the world. It also retained a Roman character to it in terms of a church hierarchy and being patriarchal. Especially in the West, the Catholic Church emerged as the institution that like preserved Christianity. And there's a hierarchy to the organization of the church, and everybody who was in it was a man. So with all this context, we can get to our key points. on the Pax Romana and the rise and diffusion of Christianity. Now, to summarize all of that into notes, here's what you should write down. Christianity originated in a remote corner of the Roman Empire, in modern-day Israel, Palestine, during the Pax Romana. We've already learned in previous units that Christianity is a monotheistic religion that emerged out of Judaism, and that it is universalizing, meaning it actively seeks converts, and it was established by somebody named Jesus Christ. This religion spread because its diffusion is owed to its appeal to the poor and outcasts in society. Its universal message, Christianity, holds that everybody can be saved. You don't have to be rich, you don't have to be from a certain ethnicity. It is a message that is open to everybody. And it diffused because of perfect timing. The Pax Romana provided safe roads and passage for merchants and missionaries to spread religious ideas throughout the empire in a way that was safer than probably any previous time in history for that region. Although Christians were persecuted at first in the Roman Empire, it was eventually adopted as the official religion when the Emperor Constantine converted. As Christianity gained popularity, Roman rulers wanted to use that popularity as a glue to hold an expansive and diverse empire together. And so it was adopted as the official religion then. Even after Rome fell, it remained the dominant religion in Europe and adopted elements of Roman organization when it was institutionalized in the Catholic Church, with the Pope at the very top, and then bishops and priests and a male-dominated clergy somewhere in the middle. If I'm being honest, I'm not Catholic and I don't know the intricacies of all of that, but that's the general outline. And you can see on the map on the bottom right of this slide which areas it spread to at first and then kind of how it blobbed out through Europe over time, over hundreds of years still. Our story ends eventually beyond the time period that we're studying, with Christianity conquering a large swath of the globe. If you look at the map on the bottom, purple indicates Christian populations that are 50% of above of the population. So for a little tiny religion that started in a little tiny corner of the Roman Empire, not too shabby.